Section 21 of Manners, Customs, and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Manners, Customs, and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period by Paul Lacroix. Section 21. Taxes, Money, and Finance. Taxes under the Roman rule. Money exactions of the Merovingian kings. Varieties of money. Financial laws under Charlemagne. Missi Dominici. Increase of taxes owing to the Crusades. Organization of finances by Louis IX. Extortions of Philippe le Bel. Pecuniary embarrassments of his successors. Charles V reestablishes order in finances. Disasters of France under Charles VI. Charles VII and Jacques Coeur. Changes in taxation from Louis XI to Francois I. The great financiers. Florimond Robert. If we believe Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War, the Gauls were groaning in his time under the pressure of taxation and struggled hard to remove it. Rome lightened their burden, but the fiscal system of the metropolis imperceptibly took root in all the Roman provinces. There was an arbitrary personal tax called the poll tax, and a land tax which was named sin, calculated according to the area of the holding. Besides these, there were taxes on articles of consumption, on salt, on the import and export of all articles of merchandise, on sales by auction, also on marriages, on burials, and on houses. There were also legacy and succession duties and taxes on slaves, according to their number. Tolls on highways were also created, and the treasury went so far as to tax the hearth. Hence the origin of the name, feu, which was afterwards applied to each household or family group assembled in the same house or sitting before the same fire. A number of other taxes sprung up, called sordides, from which the nobility and the government functionaries were exempt. This ruinous system of taxation, rendered still more unsupportable by the exaction of the proconsuls and the violence of their subordinates, went on increasing down to the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. The Middle Ages gave birth to a new order of things. The municipal administration, composed in great part of Gallo-Roman citizens, did not perceptibly deviate from the customs established for 5 centuries. But each invading nation by degrees introduced new habits and ideas into the countries they subdued. The Germans and Franks, having become masters of part of Gaul, established themselves on the lands which they had divided between them. The great domains, with their revenues, which had belonged to the emperors, naturally became the property of the barbarian chiefs, and served to defray the expenses of their houses or their courts. These chiefs, at each general assembly of the leude, or great vassals, received presents of money, of arms, of horses, and of various objects of home or of foreign manufacture. For a long time these gifts were voluntary. The territorial fief, which was given to those soldiers who had deserved it by their military service, involved from the holders a personal service to the king. They had to attend him on his journeys, to follow him to war, and to defend him under all circumstances. The fief was entirely exempt from taxes. Many misdeeds, even robberies and other crimes, which were ordinarily punishable by death, were pardonable on payment of a proportionate fine, and oaths, in many cases, might be absolved in the same way. Thus a large revenue was received, which was generally divided equally between the state, the procurator fiscal, and the king. War, which was almost constant in those turbulent times, furnished the barbarian kings with occasional resources, which were usually much more important than the ordinary supplies from taxation. The first chiefs of the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Franks sought means of replenishing their treasuries by their victorious arms. Alaric, Totila, and Clovis thus amassed enormous wealth without troubling themselves to place the government finances on a satisfactory basis. We see, however, a semblance of financial organization in the institutions of Alaric and his successors. Subsequently, the great Theodoric, who had studied the administrative theories of the Byzantine court, exercised his genius in endeavoring to work out an accurate system of finance which was adopted in Italy. Gregory of Tours, a writer of the 16th century, relates in several passages of his History of the Franks that they exhibited the same repugnance to compulsory taxation as the Germans of the time of Tacitus. The lewd considered that they owed nothing to the treasury, and to force them to submit to taxation was not an easy matter. About the year 465, Childeric I, father of Clovis, lost his crown for wishing all classes to submit to taxation equally. In 673, Childeric II, king of Austrasia, had one of these lewd named Baudouin flogged with rods for daring to reproach him with the injustice of certain taxes. He, however, was afterwards assassinated by this same Baudouin, and the lewd maintained their right of immunity. A century before, the lewd were already quarreling with royalty on account of the taxes, which they refused to pay, and they sacrificed Queen Brunhilde because she attempted to enrich the treasury with the confiscated property of a few nobles who had rebelled against her authority. The wealth of the Frank kings, which was always very great, was a continual object of envy, and on one occasion Chilperic I, king of Soissons, having the lewd in league with him, laid his hands on the wealth amassed by his father, Clotaire I, which was kept in the palace of Brienne. He was nevertheless obliged to share his spoils with his brothers and their followers, who came in arms to force him to refund what he had taken. Chilperic was so much in awe of these lewd that he did not ask them for money. His wife, the much feared Frédégonde, did not, however, exempt them more than Brunhilde had done, and her judges or ministers, Audon and Mimus, having met with an insurmountable resistance in endeavoring to force taxation on the nobles, nearly lost their lives in consequence. The custom of numbering the population, such as was carried on in Rome through the censors, appears to have been observed under the Merovingian kings, at the request of the Bishop of Poitiers. Childebert gave orders to amend the census taken under Sigebert, king of Austrasia. It is a most curious document, mentioned by Gregory of Tours. The ancient division, he says, had been one so unequal, owing to the subdivision of properties and other changes which time had made in the condition of the taxpayers, that the poor, the orphans, and the helpless classes generally alone bore the real burden of taxation. Florentius, comptroller of the king's household, and Romulfus, count of the palace, remedied this abuse. After a closer examination of the changes which had taken place, they relieved the taxpayers who were too heavily rated, and placed the burden on those who could better afford it. This direct taxation continued on this plan until the time of the kings of the second dynasty. The Franks, who had not the privilege of exemption, paid a poll tax and a house tax. About a tenth was charged on the produce of highly cultivated lands, a little more on that of lands of an inferior description, and a certain measure, a cruche of wine, on the produce of every half-acre of vineyard. There were assessors and royal agents, charged with levying such taxes and regulating the farming of them. In spite of this precaution, however, an edict of Clovis II, in the year 615, censors the mode of imposing rates and taxes. It orders that they shall only be levied in the places where they have been authorized, and forbade their being used under any pretext whatever for any other object than that for which they were imposed. Under the Merovingians, specie was not in common use, although the precious metals were abundant among the Gauls, as their mines of gold and silver were not yet exhausted. Money was rarely coined, except on great occasions, such as a coronation, the birth of an heir to the throne, the marriage of a prince, or the commemoration of a decisive victory. It is even probable that each time that money was used in large sums, the pound or the sou of gold was represented more by ingots of metal than by stamped coin. The third of the sou of gold, which was coined on state occasions, seemed to have been used only as a commemorative medal to be distributed amongst the great officers of state, and this circumstance explains their extreme rarity. The general character of the coinage, whether of gold, silver, or of the baser metals of the Burgundian, Austrasian, and Frank kings, differs little from what it had been at the time of the last of the Roman emperors, though the angel bearing the cross gradually replaced the renommée victorieux formerly stamped on the coins. Christian monograms and symbols of the Trinity were often intermingled with the initials of the sovereign. It also became common to combine in a monogram letters thought to be sacred or lucky, such as C, M, S, T, etc., also to introduce the names of places which, perhaps, have since disappeared, as well as some particular mark or sign special to each mint. Some of these are very difficult to understand, and present a number of problems which have yet to be solved. Unfortunately, the names of places on Merovingian coins, to the number of about 900, have rarely been studied by coin collectors, expert both as geographers and linguists. We find, for example, 100 distinct mints, and up to the present time have not been able to determine where the greater number of them were situated. From the time that Clovis became a Christian, he loaded the church with favors, and it soon possessed considerable revenues, and enjoyed many valuable immunities. The sons of Clovis contested these privileges, but the church resisted for a time, though she was eventually obliged to give way to the iron hand of Charles Martel. In 732, this great military chieftain, after his struggle with Rainfroy, and after his brilliant victories over the Saxons, the Bavarians, the Swiss, and the Saracens, stripped the clergy of their landed possessions, in order to distribute them amongst his lewd, who by this means he secured as his creatures, and who were, therefore, ever willing and eager to serve him in arms. On ascending the throne, King Pepe, who wanted to pacify the church, endeavored, as far as possible, to obliterate the recollection of the wrongs of which his father had been guilty towards her. He ordered the deme and the non, 10th and 9th deniers levied on the value of lands, to be placed to the account of the possessors of each ecclesiastical domain, on their undertaking to repair the buildings, churches, chateaux, abbeys, and presbyteries, and to restore to the owners the properties on which they held mortgages. The nobles long resented this, and it required the authority and the example of Charlemagne to soothe the contending parties and to make church and state act in harmony. Charlemagne renounced the arbitrary rights established by the mayors of the palace, and retained only those which long usage had legitimized. He registered them clearly in a code called the Capitulaire, in which he introduced the ancient laws of the Ripuaires, the Burgundians, and the Franks, arranging them so as to suit the organization and requirements of his vast empire. From that time each freeman subscribed to the military service according to the amount of his possessions. The great vassal or fiscal judge was no longer allowed to practice extortion on those citizens appointed to defend the state. Freemen could legally refuse all servile or obligatory work imposed on them by the nobles, and the amount of labor to be performed by the serfs was lessened. Without absolutely abolishing the authority of local customs in matters of finance, or penalties which had been illegally exacted, they were suspended by laws decided at the Chambre de Mai, by the counts, and by the Leudes, in presence of the emperor. Arbitrary taxes were abolished, as they were no longer required. Food, and any articles of consumption, and military munitions were exempted from taxation, and the revenues derived from tolls on road gates, on bridges, and on city gates, etc., were applied to the purpose for which they were imposed, namely, to the repair of the roads, the bridges, and the fortified enclosures. The héribat, a fine of 60 sols, which in those days would amount to more than 6,000 francs, was imposed on any holder of a fief who refused military service, and each noble was obliged to pay this for every one of his vassals who was absent when summoned to the king's banner. These fines must have produced considerable sums. A special law exempted ecclesiastics from bearing arms, and Charlemagne decreed that their possessions should be sacred and untouched, and everything was done to ensure the payment of the indemnity, diem and non, which was due to them. Charlemagne also superintended the coining and circulation of money. He directed that the silver sou should exactly contain the 22nd part by weight of the pound. He also directed that money should only be coined in the imperial palaces. He forbade the circulation of spurious coin. He ordered base coiners to be severely punished, and imposed heavy fines upon those who refused to accept the coin in legal circulation. The tithe due to the Church, which was imposed at the National Assembly in 779, and dispersed by the diocesan bishops, gave rise to many complaints and much opposition. This tithe was in addition to that paid to the king, which was of itself sufficiently heavy. The right of claiming the two tithes, however, had a common origin, so that the sovereign defended his own right in protecting those of the Church. This is set forth in the text of the Capitulaire from the year 794 to 829. What had originally been only a voluntary and pious offering of a few of the faithful, says the author of the Histoire financière de la France, became thus a perpetual tax upon agriculture, custom rather than law enforcing its payment, and a tithe which was, at first, limited to the produce of the soil, soon extended itself to cattle and other livestock. Royal delegates, the missi dominici, who were invested with complex functions and with very extensive power, traveled through the empire, exercising legal jurisdiction over all matters of importance. They assembled all of the placites, or provincial authorities, and inquired particularly into the collection of the public revenue. During their tours, which took place 4 times a year, They either personally annulled unjust sentences or submitted them to the emperor. They denounced any irregularities on the part of the counts, punished the negligences of their assessors, and often, in order to replace unworthy judges, they had to resort to a system of election of assessors, chosen from among the people. They verified the returns for the census, superintended the keeping up of the royal domains, corrected frauds in matter of taxation, and punished usurers as much as base coiners, for at that time money was not considered a commercial article, nor was it thought right that a money-lender should be allowed to carry on a trade which required a remuneration proportionate to the risk which he incurred. These missi dominici were too much hated by the great vassals to outlive the introduction of the feudal system. Their royal masters, as they themselves gradually lost a part of their own privileges and power, could not sustain the authority of these officers. Dukes, counts, and barons, having become magistrates, arbitrarily levied new taxes, imposed new fines, and appropriated the king's tribute to such an extent that, towards the end of the 10th century, the laws of Charlemagne had no longer any weight. We then find a number of new taxes levied for the benefit of the nobles, the very names of which have fallen into disuse with the feudal claims which they represented. Among these new taxes were those of escort and entree, of mortmain, of lods of ventes, of relief, the champars, the taille, the fouage, and the various fees for wine pressing, grinding, baking, etc., all of which were payable without prejudice to the tithes due to the king and the church. However, as the royal tithe was hardly ever paid, the kings were obliged to look to other means for replenishing their treasuries, and coining false money was a common practice. Unfortunately, each great vassal vied with the kings in this, and to such an extent that the enormous quantity of bad money coined during the 9th century completed the public ruin, and made this a sad period of social chaos. The freeman was no longer distinguishable from the villain, nor the villain from the serf. Serfdom was general. Men found themselves, as it were, slaves, in possession of land which they labored at with the sweat of their brow, only to cultivate for the benefit of others. The towns even, with the exception of a few privileged cities, such as Florence, Paris, Lyon, Rheims, Metz, Strasbourg, Marseille, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Milan, were under the dominion of some ecclesiastical or lay lord, and only enjoyed liberty of a more or less limited character. Towards the end of the 11th century, under Philip I, the enthusiasm for crusades became general, and, as all the nobles joined in the holy mission of freeing the tomb of Jesus Christ from the hands of the infidels, large sums of money were required to defray the costs. New taxes were accordingly imposed, but, as these did not produce enough at once, large sums were raised by the sale of some of the feudal rights. Certain franchises were in this way sold by the nobles to the boroughs, towns, and abbeys, though, in not a few instances, these very privileges had been formerly plundered from the places to which they were now sold. Fines were exacted from any person declining to go to Palestine, and foreign merchants, especially the Jews, were required to subscribe large sums. A number of the nobles holding fiefs were reduced to the lowest expedients with a view to raising money, and even sold their estates at a low price, or mortgaged them to the very Jews whom they taxed so heavily. Every town in which the spirit of Gallo-Roman municipality was preserved
took advantage of these circumstances to extend its liberties. Each monarch, too, found this a favorable opportunity to add new fiefs to the crown, and to recall as many great vassals as possible under his dominion. It was at this period that communities arose, and that the first charters of freedom, which were obligatory and binding contracts between the king and the people, date their origin. Besides the annual fines due to the king and the feudal lords, and in addition to the general subsidies, such as the quit rent and the tithes, these communities had to provide for the repair of the walls or ramparts, for the paving of the streets, the cleaning of the pits, the watch on the city gates, and the various expenses of local administration. Louis le Gros endeavored to make a rearrangement of the taxes, and to establish them on a definite basis. By his orders, a new register of the lands throughout the kingdom was commenced, but various calamities caused this useful measure to be suspended. In 1149, Louis le Jeune, in consequence of a disaster which had befallen the Crusaders, did what none of his predecessors had dared to attempt. He exacted from all his subjects a sol per pound on their income. This tax, which amounted to a 20th part of income, was paid even by the Church, which, for example's sake, did not take advantage of its immunities. 40 years later, at a council, or great parliament, called by Philippe Augustus, a new crusade was decided upon, and under the name of Saladin's tithe, an annual tax was imposed on all property, whether landed or personal, of all who did not take up the cross to go to the Holy Land. The nobility, however, so violently resisted this, that the king was obliged to substitute for it a general tax, which, although it was still more productive, was less offensive in its mode of collection. On returning to France in 1191, Philippe Augustus rated and taxed everyone, nobility, bourgeois, and clergy, in order to prosecute the great wars in which he was engaged, and to provide for the first paid troops ever known in France.
He began by confirming the enormous confiscations of the properties of the Jews who had been banished from the kingdom, and afterwards sold a temporary permission to some of the richest of them to return.
The Jews at that time were the only possessors of available funds, as they were the only people who trafficked and who lent money on interest. On this account the government were glad to recall them, so as to have at hand a valuable resource which it could always make use of. As the king could not, on his own authority, levy taxes upon the vassals of feudal lords, on emergencies he convoked the barons, who discussed financial matters with the king, and when the sum required was settled, an order of assessment was issued, and the barons undertook the collection of the taxes. The assessment was always fixed higher than was required for the king's wants, and the barons, having paid the king what was due to him, retained the surplus, which they divided amongst themselves. The creation of a public revenue, raised by the contributions of all classes of society, with a definite sum to be kept in reserve, thus dates from the reign of Philip Augustus. The annual income of the state at that time amounted to 36,000 marks, or 72,000 pounds weight of silver, about 16 or 17 million francs of present currency. The treasury, which was kept in the great tower of the Temple, was under the custody of 7 bourgeois of Paris, and a king's clerk kept a register of receipts and disbursements. This treasury must have been well filled at the death of Philip Augustus, for that monarch's legacies were very considerable. One of his last wishes deserves to be mentioned, and this was a formal order which he gave to Louis VIII to employ a certain sum, left him for that purpose, solely and entirely for the defence of the kingdom. When Louis IX, in 1242, at Taillebourg and at Sat, had defeated the great vassals who had rebelled against him, he hastened to regulate the taxes by means of a special code which bore the name of the Établissement. The taxes thus imposed fell upon the whole population, and even lands belonging to the church, houses which the nobles did not themselves occupy, rural properties and leased holdings were all subjected to them. There were, however, two different kinds of rates, one called the occupation rate and the other the rate of exploitation, and they were both collected according to a register kept in the most regular and systematic manner possible. Ancient custom had maintained a tax exceptionally in the following cases: when a noble dubbed his son a knight, or gave his daughter in marriage, when he had to pay a ransom, and when he set out on a campaign against the enemies of the church or for the defense of the country. These taxes were called ladocatricar. At this period despotism too often overruled custom, and the good King Louis IX, by granting legal power to custom, tried to bring it back to the true principles of justice and humanity. He was, however, none the less jealous of his own personal privileges, especially as regarded coining. He insisted that coining should be exclusively carried on in his palace, as in the times of the Carlovingian kings, and he required every coin to be made of a definite standard of weight, which he himself fixed. In this way he secured the exclusive control over the mint. For the various localities, towns, or counties directly under the crown, Louis IX settled the mode of levying taxes. Men of integrity were elected by the vote of the General Assembly, consisting of the three orders, namely of the nobility, the clergy, and the tiers état, to assess the taxation of each individual, and these assessors themselves were taxed by 4 of their own number.
The custom of levying proprietary subsidies in each small feudal jurisdiction could not be abolished, notwithstanding the king's desire to do so, owing to the power still held by the nobles. Nobles were forbidden to levy a rate under any consideration without previously holding a meeting of the vassals and their tenants. The tolls on roads, bridges, fairs, and markets, and the harbor dues were kept up notwithstanding their obstruction to commerce, with the exception that free passage was given to corn passing from one province to another. The exemption from taxes which had been dearly bought were removed, and the nobles were bound not to divert the revenue received from tolls for any purpose other than those for which they were legitimately intended. The nobles were also required to guard the roads from sunrise to sunset, and they were made responsible for robberies committed upon travelers within their domains. Louis IX, by refunding the value of goods which had been stolen through the carelessness of his officers, himself showed an example of the respect due to the law. Those charged with collecting the king's dues, as well as the mayors whose duty it was to take custody of the money contributed, and to receive the taxes on various articles of consumption, worked under the eye of officials appointed by the king, who exercised a financial jurisdiction which developed later in the department or office called the Chamber of Accounts. A tax somewhat similar to the tithe on funds was imposed for the benefit of the nobles on property held by corporations or under charter, in order to compensate the treasury for the loss of the succession duties. This tax represented about the 5th part of the value of the estate.
To cover the enormous expenses of the 2 crusades, Louis IX, however, was obliged to levy 2 new taxes, called decimes, from his already overburdened people.
It does not, however, appear that this excessive taxation alienated the affection of his subjects. Their minds were entirely taken up with the pilgrimage to the East, and the pious monarch, notwithstanding his fruitless sacrifices and his disastrous expeditions, earned for himself the title of Prince of Peace of Justice. From the time of Louis IX. Down to that of Philippe le Bel, who was the most extravagant of kings, and at the same time the most ingenious in raising funds for the state treasury, the financial movement of Europe took root, and eventually became centralized in Italy. In Florence was presented an example of the concentration of the most complete municipal privileges which a great flourishing city could desire. Pisa, Genoa, and Venice attracted a part of the European commerce towards the Adriatic and the Mediterranean.
Everywhere the Jews and Lombards, already well initiated into the mysterious system of credit and accustomed to lend money, started banks and pawn establishments, where jewels, diamonds, glittering arms, and paraphernalia of all kinds were deposited by princes and nobles as security for loans. The tax collectors, maltôtiers, a name derived from the Italian mala tolta, unjust tax, receivers or farmers of taxes, paid dearly for exercising their calling, which was always a dishonorable one, and was at times exercised with a great amount of harshness and even of cruelty. The treasury required a certain number of deniers, obol, or piques, a small coin varying in value in each province, to be paid by these men for each bank operation they effected, and for every pound in value of merchandise they sold, for they and the Jews were permitted to carry on trades of all kinds without being subject to any kind of rates, taxes, work, military service, or municipal dues. Philippe le Bel, owing to his interminable wars against the King of Castile, and against England, Germany, and Flanders, was frequently so embarrassed as to be obliged to resort to extraordinary subsidies in order to carry them on. In 1295 he called upon his subjects for a forced loan, and soon after he shamelessly required them to pay the 100th part of their income, and after but a short interval he demanded another 50th part.
The king assumed the exclusive right to debase the value of the coinage, which caused him to be commonly called the base coiner, and no sovereign ever coined a greater quantity of base money. He changed the standard or name of current coin with a view to counterbalance the mischief arising from the illicit coinage of the nobles, and especially to baffle the base traffic of the Jews and the Lombards, who occasionally would obtain possession of a great part of the coin and mutilate each piece before restoring it to circulation. In this way they upset the whole monetary economy of the realm, and secured immense profits to themselves.
In 1303 the ad valeur, which was afterwards called the ad de l'ost, or the army tax, was invented by Philippe le Bel for raising an army without opening his purse. It was levied without distinction upon dukes, counts, barons, ladies, damsels, archbishops, bishops, abbots, chapters, colleges, and in fact upon all classes, whether noble or not. Nobles were bound to furnish one knight, mounted, equipped, and in full armour, for every 500 marks of land which they possessed. Those who were not nobles had to furnish 6 foot soldiers for every 100 households. By another enactment of this king, the privilege was granted of paying money instead of complying with these demands for men, and a sum of 100 livres, about 10,000 francs of present currency, was exacted for each armed knight, and 2 sols, about 10 francs per diem, for each soldier which anyone failed to furnish. An outcry was raised throughout France at this proceeding, and rebellions broke out in several provinces. In Paris the mob destroyed the house of Stephen Barbet, master of the Mint, and insulted the king in his palace. It was necessary to enforce the royal authority with vigor, and after considerable difficulty peace was at last restored, and Philippe learned, though too late, that in matters of taxation the people should first be consulted. In 1313, for the first time, the bourgeoisie, syndics, or deputies of communities, under the name of tiers état, third order of the state, were called to exercise the right of freely voting the assistance or subsidy which it pleased the king to ask of them. After this memorable occasion, an edict was issued ordering a levy of 6 deniers in the pound on every sort of merchandise sold in the kingdom. Paris paid this without hesitation, whereas in the provinces there was much discontented murmuring. But the following year the king, having tried to raise the 6 deniers voted by the Assembly of 1313 to 12, the clergy, nobility, and tiers état combined to resist the extortions of the government. Philippe le Bel died, after having yielded to the opposition of his indignant subjects, and in his last moments he recommended his son to exercise moderation in taxing and honesty in coining. On the accession of Louis X in 1315, war against the Flemish was imminent, although the royal treasury was absolutely empty. The king, unfortunately, in spite of his father's advice, attempted systematically to tamper with the coinage, and he also commenced the exaction of fresh taxes, to the great exasperation of his subjects.
He was obliged, through fear of a general rebellion, to do away with the tithe established for the support of the army, and to sacrifice the superintendent of finances,
Enguerrand de Marigny,
to the public indignation which was felt against him.
This man, without being allowed to defend himself, was tried by an extraordinary commission of Parliament for embezzling the public money, was condemned to death, and was hung on the gibbet of Montfaucon. Not daring to risk a convocation of the States General of the kingdom, Louis X ordered the seneschal to convoke the provincial assemblies, and thus obtained a few subsidies, which he promised to refund out of the revenues of his domain. The clergy even allowed themselves to be taxed, and closed their eyes to the misappropriation of the funds which were supposed to be held in reserve for a new crusade. Taxes giving commercial franchise and of exchange were levied, which were paid by the Jews, Lombards, Tuscans, and other Italians. Judiciary offices were sold by auction. The trading class purchased letters of nobility, as they had already done under Philippe le Bel, and more than this, the enfranchisement of serfs, which had commenced in 1298, was continued on the payment of a tax, which varied according to the means of each individual. In consequence of this system, personal servitude was almost entirely abolished under Philippe de Long, brother of Louis X.
Each province, under the reign of this rapacious and necessitous monarch, demanded some concessions from the crown, and almost always obtained it at a money value. Normandy and Burgundy, which were dreaded more than any other province on account of their turbulence, received remarkable concessions. The base coin was withdrawn from circulation, and Louis X attempted to forbid the right of coinage to those who broke the wise laws of St. Louis. The idea of bills of exchange arose at this period. Thanks to the peace concluded with Flanders, on which occasion that country paid into the hands of the sovereign 30,000 florins in gold for arrears of taxes, and, above all, owing to the rules of economy and order, from which Philip V, surnamed the Long, never deviated, the attitude of France became completely altered. We find the king initiating reform by reducing the expenses of his household, He convened around his person a great council, which met monthly to examine and discuss matters of public interest. He allowed only one national treasury for the reception of the state revenues. He required the treasurers to make a half-yearly statement of their account and a daily journal of receipts and disbursements. He forbade clerks of the treasury to make entries either of receipts or expenditures, however trifling, without the authority and supervision of accountants, whom he also compelled to assist at the checking of sums received or paid by the money changers.
The farming of the crown lands, the king's taxes, the stamp registration, and the jail duties were sold by auction, subject to certain regulations with regard to guarantee. The bailiffs and seneschals sent in their accounts to Paris annually. They were not allowed to absent themselves without the king's permission, and they were formerly forbidden, under pain of confiscation, or even a severer penalty, to speculate with the public money. The operations of the treasury were at this period always involved in the greatest mystery.
End of section 21. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com.